Well, before I get to Michael O'Brien, the Victorian opposition leader, to talk about Victorian Labor's involvement in China's Belt and Road Initiative, it's important to understand exactly what China is trying to do here. A report on the so-called One Belt, One Road initiative prepared for Australian MPs by the Parliamentary Library confirms that China is using this program of cheap loans to further its strategic interest. Now, let me quote the report, and it says, the Bank of China has clearly noted that Belt and Road is intended to make the renminbi, that's the Chinese currency, the main trading and investment currency in the countries involved in this initiative. China has also been stressing the role of overseas Chinese people in promoting Belt and Road projects. The report also says that Chinese officials are quite open that Belt and Road is, quote, aimed at creating a Eurasia-wide Chinese-led bloc to counter the United States. Now, Belt and Road is just an umbrella term used to cover a range of Chinese-funded and usually Chinese-built infrastructure projects around the globe. Unusually, it's a condition of funding that the host country uses Chinese companies and often Chinese workers to get this work done. And often the relevant facilities are then run by Chinese personnel. For vulnerable countries and ambitious leaders, a big advantage of Belt and Road money is that it rarely involves the accountability and transparency requirements of standard loans and is often accompanied by massive political donations. While the most notorious Belt and Road project is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka that's now Chinese owned after the Sri Lankan government couldn't meet repayments and has now hosted Chinese submarine visits, there are many other projects in Europe, Africa, Asia and the Pacific. For instance, there's a white elephant hydro dam in Ecuador, a Chinese-run satellite control station in Argentina, a railway upgrade in Hungary, a facial recognition project in Zimbabwe, port construction and operation projects in Israel, coal-fired power stations in Pakistan, gas pipelines in Tajikistan, a new port in Burma with rail access to China, a high-speed rail line in Java, and a wharf big enough for an aircraft carrier close to us in Vanuatu. Now, the degree of Chinese control of the operation of these projects varies from country to country, but clearly all of them are prestige projects designed to demonstrate China's importance and benevolence to the host country. Now, let me bring you my guest, Victorian opposition leader, Liberal, Mr. Michael O'Brien. Michael, thank you very much for your time tonight. I know you've been talking about this issue for some time. I know you're a former State Treasurer, and I also worked with you many, many years ago when you were on Peter Costello's senior team in Canberra. And so I've got to ask you, you could read a balance sheet, you understand what a debt burden looks like for a state like your own in Victoria. Why on earth is Victoria going down this path?
Peter, your guess is as good as mine because this smacks of debt trap diplomacy. There is nothing wrong with trading with other nations where you can do it to your mutual advantage. Australia's always been a great trading nation. But why Daniel Andrews would want to sign Victoria up to something which is it's been secretive, it is so lopsided, and it seems to be very much in Beijing's interest because at the moment all we're seeing is Chinese companies building Victorian infrastructure and we're seeing Victorian farmers being hit by Chinese tariffs. So when you take into account the debt, the potential loss of control, and the one-way traffic of where the economic benefits are flowing, you have to ask, why has Daniel Andrews signed Victoria up to this?
Look, I covered the Victorian election pretty closely here. I don't remember much debate on anything that looked like the Belt and Road initiative. We know the MOUs were signed last year. We're told, and there's very little we actually know, but we're told there's more agreements pending in June. What are the actual projects we're talking about here, and what say has the Victorian voter had in all of this Chinese deal?
Well, Peter, of course, the Victorian voters had no say at all. Daniel Andrews signed Victoria up in secret, did not tell the Victorian voters about it, did not tell the Victorian Parliament about it before he signed up. Federally, if you sign up a treaty, Those treaties are laid before the Parliament. There's a joint standing committee. These things are explored, and there's a bit of sunlight, there's a bit of disinfectant used to try and make sure that any deal done is in the public interest. Daniel Andrews has refused to do that with these Belt and Road deals. Now you ask what particular projects has he done a deal on? The answer is we don't know. He refuses to tell the public. His ministers won't tell the public how much we're borrowing from China or what projects we're borrowing it for. But we do know that Chinese government-owned companies are building the Melbourne Metro Tunnel. They are removing Victoria's level crossings. They're building our trains. So as I say, the benefits that we've seen so far seem to be pretty much flowing one way, and it's not our way.
How does it work, though, that you can get a state government sign a deal that's normally between two countries, that the money is then borrowed from China under this deal, that the jobs are Chinese jobs, that the businesses are Chinese businesses, that the imports of steel and things like that are probably our iron ore sent and processed in China coming back to us? Where's the benefit for Victorians in all of this?
Well, that's the question, Peter, because it's hard to see where the benefit is. Yeah, you do get the impression this is more about Daniel Andrews pursuing his own personal interest, pursuing his personal ego, wanting to strut the world stage rather than be the state premier that he is. And the fact that the federal government has deliberately not signed up to Belt and Road, and Daniel Andrews has undermined that by doing his own deal, I think that tells you all you need to know. It tells you this is more about Daniel Andrews, his political ego and his interest in doing deals rather than actually the interest of Victorians or, for that matter, Australians.
Look, we know ever since he became leader of the party here in Victoria, he has had almost a yearly trip to China. A lot, we say, or we're told, that a lot of the background to this particular agreement has come out of that relationship building. There has been connections inside his office and close to his government that have materialised in some of these negotiations, some where people have been paid by taxpayers to be a party to negotiations. What is the capacity you have inside the Victorian Parliament to probe some of these issues?
Well, Peter, it's very hard to probe issues when the Parliament's been shut down, which is what Daniel Andrews has effectively done since the COVID-19 pandemic started. We got to meet for basically about half a day to rush through some appropriation legislation. Now, he's finally agreed to let us come back to Parliament next week. Frankly, it's outrageous. We should not have had Parliament suspended. This Premier, has taken on more control over the lives of individual Victorians than any Premier in our state's history, and yet he's refused to allow Parliament to sit. But we are coming back next week, and we'll be using those opportunities to get to the bottom of these deals, because Victorians deserve transparency and they deserve accountability. First day in Parliament as Liberal leader after the election, I did remind Daniel Andrews, I said, well, Premier, you won the election, you've been elected to govern, but you haven't been elected to rule. And I think Andrews forgets that. He genuinely hates opposition, hates questions, tries to avoid accountability. But this is about Victoria's interests, it's about Victorian jobs, it's about Victoria's sovereignty. And I think the Premier must answer the questions we'll be putting to him.
Look, I don't understand how it works down in Victoria. It seems to be pretty rogue at the moment. A guy can do this deal without raising it in an election. He can say he will not bring in an injecting room, and he has, and in fact he's enlarged it. He just calls it a trial. He says he won't do anything on gender laws, or certainly is silent on that. He brings them in once he's elected. The same thing with euthanasia and many other things. It's almost like there's no democracy here, Michael. And just the other day, you know, the debt has doubled here, doubled and more in Victoria, $50 billion in the last 2 financial years alone. What on earth is going on?
Look, Peter, this is a Premier who, in my view, is drunk on power. He's completely destroyed Victoria's budget and balance sheet. In fact, just tonight, just as we're going to air, Standard & Poor's has given a negative outlook on Victoria's debt rating. Now, that's the step before you lose your AAA. So not only is Daniel Andrews maxing out Victorians' credit card, putting tens of billions of dollars of extra debt, which will have to be paid by the next generation, but we'll be paying higher interest rates because we're on the verge of losing our AAA credit rating, which so many governments and Victorians have worked so hard to secure over the years. This is a Premier who makes it all about him. I'm the opposition leader who wants to make it all about Victorians. Our economy's been smashed by the response to the pandemic. We lost 127,000 jobs last month. Small businesses have barely got a heartbeat, Peter, and we need to get this state back open. We need to get back to work, back in business, and we need it with a pro-jobs recovery, not another high-taxing, high-debt recovery, which is all Daniel Andrews knows.